Hi there. Today I'm going to be presenting on women's rights in Bellefonte 100 years later. To start off, my name is Alli Zajac. I'm a senior majoring in international politics and French with a minor in history at Penn State, and I'm from State College, Pennsylvania. To first understand the women who will be the main topic of my presentation today, we must first understand the historical context under which they lived. To prepare for my research, I asked myself, what were the political and social factors at play which would have molded the ways that these ladies comported themselves? A lot of the work for women's rights began with the temperance movement in the 19th century. Alcoholism was a huge problem which ruined many families. Having a few drinks after work became a way for men to exert their masculinity, but it ended up leading to poverty and issues of domestic violence at a time when women did not have control over their own financial well-being or that of their children and were often unable to divorce abusive spouses. Men would routinely drink their families out of house and home and abuse their families in an alcoholic rage. As a solution, temperance groups formed to advocate for the elimination of alcohol from the American diet. The goal was not to grant women control over their own finances or give them the ability to leave abusive marriages, but to make it so their husbands would take responsibility for their families. The belief was that alcohol led to highly immoral and unchristian behavior, and so the elimination of alcohol was vital to the maintenance of a Christian society. The temperance movement, being a highly religious movement, was also closely tied with the abolitionist movement, which did not always get along with the women's suffrage movement. Abolitionists and women's suffrage advocates alike believed that trying to advocate for one movement was to the detriment of another, and vice versa. Abolitionists often believed that women of any color were inferior to men of all colors, while women suffragists took a racist stance on feminism, believing that white women were, in fact, superior to other races of men and women and should have the same rights as white men. After famously being forbidden to speak at a temperance convention, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, which opposed the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment granted all men, regardless of race, the right to vote. Stanton and Anthony did not support the amendment, not because it didn't include women, but because it did enfranchise men of color. Even though the temperance movement has become synonymous with women's rights, women, like Anthony and Stanton, were not allowed to join the very first temperance unions, and thus the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, was born in 1873. Its membership was exclusive to women, and they supported many women's issues, including, but not limited to, temperance, women's suffrage, and children's education. As part of their work to eliminate alcohol, WCTU chapters across the country funded public drinking fountains to give communities access to free water as an alternative to beer and other alcoholic beverages, which was often drunk because it was safer than water. One of the only remaining WCTU fountains in Pennsylvania still stands in Bellefonte outside the courthouse. Unlike men, women's social interests were extremely limited by what was socially acceptable, and most of the acceptable clubs or groups ladies could attend were religiously affiliated, like the WCTU. This was due to concurrent social values at the time. There was a popular social theory called the separate spheres. The concept was that, in middle or upper class families at least, men left the home to support the family financially, but women were completely responsible for the maintenance of the household, which included the education of their children. The home was her sphere, her domain. It was the woman's sole responsibility to ensure that her children grew up to be good American citizens, which was almost completely synonymous with being a good Christian. To be American was to be a good Christian, and so to reject temperance values was to be un-American. This only served to spur on anti-immigration sentiment at a time when American cities were growing fuller and fuller with immigrants, in particular immigrants from countries which included alcohol as an important part of their cultural heritage, like the Germans, Irish, and Italians. Here, far away from their homelands, these immigrant groups used alcohol to connect with each other and their heritage during what must have been a lonely and isolating time. Unfortunately, because of prejudices about what it meant to be a good American, what it meant to be a good Christian, differences in opinions over drinking habits further opened the divide between immigrants and native-born citizens. This conflict over what it means to be American in a country full of immigrants is one that our nation has struggled with since its inception and one that we continue to struggle with today. If we return to the idea of separate spheres, we can understand the arguments that women first used to advocate for their right to vote. Women were supposed to be upstanding, unbreakable moral characters, protectors of the family unit and children. It was argued that if they were granted the right to vote, They would be a calming, dovish influence on the hawkish tendencies of men. We know now that this is not true on the whole. Women tend to have the same voting patterns as their close male relatives. This makes sense since we often get our values from our parents and are unlikely to marry someone whose values do not closely align with ours. This argument that women are innately moral, pure creatures to be placed on a pedestal has become known as the argument of first wave feminism, which is vastly different from the second wave feminism of the 60s and 70s, even the third and fourth waves of my lifetime. Each of these waves have come to include more and more in the definition of what makes a woman and in what manner we are equal to men. Now, understanding the factors at play, when we zoom into Bellefonte, we can see it as a tiny microcosm, an example of the country as a whole during the women's suffrage movement. On the following slide, I've included some interesting quotes from a few different newspapers which exemplify the varying opinions on women's suffrage, which existed right here in Center County. Now, really, the reporter had almost made up its mind not to say a word about the improvements on the diamond by the municipality, but it couldn't refrain. A stranger passing along just now might be led to think that we are ahead of the times and already had women's suffrage, or at least women control. From the Center Reporter, October 4th, 1915. The Massachusetts women suffragists have resolved that the Women's Suffrage Party has no faith in Republicans or Democrats. Oh dear, then who will they have foot their milliner bills? From the Center Reporter, October 18th, 1877. As it is, suffrage is literally dirt cheap to every masculine thing on two legs, even if the legs are tangled. From the Center Reporter, July 22nd, 1875. Here, the Center Reporter is referring to the fact that men often drank excessively at polls, which made it easier for politicians to buy their votes. The whole idea of drinking at the polling place must have really felt like a slap in the face for any female suffragists. It just really seems like a mockery of the democratic process. Think what the condition of women in this country will be when all the lower orders of foreigners now invading our shores, Dutch, Irish, Chinese, and Africans, legislate for them and their daughters. Think of Patrick and Sambo and Hans and Yangtung, who cannot read the Declaration of Independence, making laws for Lucretia Mott, Ernestine L. Rose, Susan B. Anthony, or Anna E. Dickinson from the Bellefonte Republican, February 17th, 1869. Again, here we can see how the anti-immigration sentiment and the first wave feminism argument work together. The author is naming all of these smart, respectable ladies who don't have the right to vote, and then they use some pretty racist names and references to talk about individuals who likely actually probably didn't speak English, but who do get to vote under the 15th Amendment and make decisions for these quite obviously educated American ladies like Susan B. Anthony and Lucretia Mott. So just here in our Bellefonte newspapers, we can see that many different groups are well represented. There were many conflicting views about women's suffrage, abolition, and temperance, and though all those movements are closely associated, their members often disagreed. As I mentioned before, abolition was seen as a threat to women's suffrage and vice versa, so women were locked out of men's abolition or temperance societies, and eventually this resulted in the formation of groups like the WCTU. But even among all of this disagreement, there were real women here in Bellefonte who made real changes that affect you and me to this day. And so even if we think of some of their actions negatively, we have to acknowledge that our present is built on their achievements in the past. I wanted to start with the MeGarvey sisters, who passed away in the 1960s and then continue on backwards in time to really see the full scope of what female activists in Bellefonte accomplished, not only for their benefit, but one day for ours. The MeGarvey sisters, Mary and Blanche, owned and operated MeGarvey Studios for over 40 years. Mary was the main photographer, but Blanche was a talented artist in her own right, specializing in tinting photos for her sister, as well as oil painting. At the beginning of her business, Mary worked solo while Blanche worked for the telephone company, but eventually Blanche worked full-time next to her sister. Mary won many awards, but arguably could not have accomplished all that she did without Blanche's assistance. Among Mary's many accomplishments were invitations to exhibit her work for the National Photography Association, as well as for an American photography exhibit in Berlin. Neither of the sisters ever married, and both are buried in Union Cemetery. I did not find any direct evidence of any difficulties the MeGarveys faced because they were of the female persuasion, but owning and operating their own photography business could not have been easy. Historically, the arts have always been heavily male-dominated. Things that we think of as especially girly today, were exclusively reserved for men. Often it was considered downright trashy or vulgar for women to participate in certain types of creativity, poetry in particular. The first women were not admitted to l'Académie des Beaux-Arts in Paris until 1897, around the time Mary would have first been getting her foot in the door of photography. According to the Directory of Pennsylvania Photographers, the MeGarvey sisters were the only female photography studio in the county for the entire period it records, beginning in 1837 and ending in 1900. The MeGarveys would continue to operate as the only female photography studio in the county for several more decades after the publication of the directory. The sisters became highly successful and had great dedication to their craft, despite the difficulties they must have faced. It was not proper for wealthier ladies like the MeGarveys to have such a public business, even as they gained more freedom with age and their spinster statuses. I also searched many years of tax records and never found the MeGarvey sisters listed with either their home or their business, meaning they likely rented it from a close male friend or relative. They likely did this to protect their business, and because they were not permitted to own it on their own, even though they are listed as the business owners in local directories. Further, even though they were highly successful, their place of residence in their brother Edward's obituary is at home, as if they were still young children being carefully watched over by their parents. Never mind that their parents had long been dead, but referring to these grown, successful women in the same manner as children undermines their success and infantilizes them in a way that makes them seem less than compared to their unmarried brothers. It places emphasis on their unmarried status rather than the contributions they have made to the community and their accomplishments. Further, their brother James was permitted to travel across the country to pursue his art career, while the sisters were limited to their hometown. The Blanchard sisters have a fairly similar story to the MeGarveys. Elizabeth and Mary were also the daughters of a wealthy family, one which had connections to Governor Andrew Curtin. Their father had been a very close associate of the former governor and fellow Bellefonte native. Mary Miles Blanchard never married and devoted her whole life to her business on West Lynn Street, which produced hand-woven baskets and employed exclusively women. Fortunately or unfortunately, there was no federal income tax until 1913 with the passage of the 16th Amendment, so tax records do not necessarily reveal how successful Mary's business was. When World War I began, she put her baskets on hold and rolled bandages at the local hospital. Mary was also a graduate from the first class at Bryn Mawr, a member of the Bellefonte WCTU, a founding member of the Bellefonte Women's Club, and served as president of that organization from 1914 to 1915. During her membership in the WCTU, Mary served as president of the Petrikin Committee, overseeing the construction of Petrikin Hall, which still stands on High Street. Her sister Elizabeth Blanchard Beach often helped out with Mary's business. In tax records and directories, Mary and Elizabeth are often cited as living at the same address, even after Elizabeth married her husband, Robert Beach. While living with her sister, Elizabeth often helped Mary maintain and oversee the business. Like her sister, Elizabeth also attended Bryn Mawr and was a charter member of the Bellefonte Women's Club. Elizabeth served as their president from 1911 to 1914, at which point Mary's term as president began. Elizabeth was also president of the Center County Suffrage Association, and according to her obituary in the Center Democrat in 1946, initiated the movement for the organization of Center County Library and was president of the Library Association. Elizabeth and Mary both made great impacts on their community in different ways. They had different expectations placed on them based on their marital statuses. Elizabeth took the more traditional route and took the initiative to form women's clubs with missions to benefit local women. She supported her sister's business as best she could. Mary's business gave local women the opportunity to make money for themselves, and she also participated in various clubs, sometimes serving as president as well. In a way, things were easier for Mary because she wasn't married, although she must have faced intense social pressure to find a husband. However, women had very limited chances to be in control of their own finances. Even though he was never really involved hands-on with the business, in several tax records, Mary's business is in her brother John's name, who was a lawyer. The earliest tax records, which include Mary and Elizabeth, list them as both property owners. However, in later years, their properties were transferred into John's name. This may have been because they were becoming more and more successful, or their advocacy work endangered their holdings, so they were transferred to a male relative for protection. Mary was likely very fortunate to have a family that supported her business, especially one full of lawyers. Both of her brothers and her father were all lawyers who could advise her on her business and financial dealings as a woman in a world where women could not even open their own bank accounts. By her death, all evidence of Mary's business had been liquidated or transferred to others, as there is no evidence of her being an entrepreneur in her final will and testament. Doctors Edith Harris Shadd and Eloise Meek were the first female doctors to call Bellefonte home. Dr. Edith Shadd was the first female president of the Center County Medical Society after the completion of her education at Wellesley College and the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. The latter of the two was the premier institution for women in medicine, and many of its graduates became physicians to the wealthy and powerful across the entire globe. Dr. Shadd herself was at one point asked to become the physician to the Empress of China and become a member of the imperial household, according to the Center Daily Times in her obituary. As for Dr. Eloise Meek, she also attended the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia. Dr. Meek famously attended Bellefonte Public Schools as a young girl, and then the Pennsylvania State College before moving on to her medical education. Upon her graduation from the Women's Medical College of Philadelphia, Dr. Meek began practicing medicine as a missionary in Alaska and eventually enlisted in the war effort for World War I, where she was stationed in New Jersey. She then returned to her home state of Pennsylvania, where she continued to practice medicine until she was unable to do so. Both doctors are buried in Union Cemetery. Women have always been crucial to the field of medicine, but to be a physician in particular has been a male-dominated choice for the last few centuries, while women were mostly forced into nursing and prohibited from continuing their formal medical education. To this day, 91% of nurses are women, while only 37% of doctors are female, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. The number of female doctors is expected to rise in coming years, but the 37% of women who currently are doctors owe their opportunities for success in their field to women like Dr. Shadd and Dr. Meek. To demonstrate her commitment to this goal of aiding other young girls to achieve the same kinds of things she had, Dr. Meek left a large portion of her estate to the establishment of a scholarship fund for needy young women of Center County, as she put it in her last will and testament. Even so, Dr. Shadd and Dr. Meek owe a lot of their success to their family connections. They were quite obviously brilliant young ladies for their families to see fit to educate them in a manner where they would one day become doctors, but their families also had the means to provide such an education. Dr. Meek's father was the proprietor and editor of the Democratic Watchman and very well connected within the Democratic Party, associating closely with other wealthy Democrats like John Blanchard, the brother of Mary and Elizabeth Blanchard. Dr. Shadd was descended from the Harris and Petrikin families of Harris Township and Petrikin Hall fame. They had opportunities that their contemporaries would not have had, the opportunity to pursue socially unacceptable or unsavory careers, or even careers at all, because of the connections of their families. Further, even though both doctors were brilliant women, they were not really recognized for their work by the government. In tax records, the two women never have an occupation listed next to their names, even though all of the men in the tax records do. The same stands for the Blanchard sisters when they appeared in tax records. Government officials never saw fit to ask any of these women how they contributed to their communities. I will say, however, Dr. Shadd did somehow manage to be listed with her proper title of doctor, albeit after her title of Mrs., so that it reads Mrs. Dr. Edith Shadd. I like to imagine a tax agent hastily copying down the letters to appease her as he appraised the value of her property. All of this brings us to the story of Miss Marion Wallace Petrikin, who I saved for last in this presentation because I felt her story was arguably the most important, the one who threaded together all of the other women I researched. Miss Petrikin's work still stares us all in the face, and she touched each of the other women in this presentation individually. As a spinster, Marion Petrikin lived a fascinating life. Her father died when she was a young girl, forcing her family to move to the lot she would inhabit for much of the rest of her life on High Street. She began teaching at the age of 15 and would run her own schoolhouse at that lot on High Street. Her brother Hardman died in the Battle of Antietam in the Civil War, begging his friend to present his sword to his sister and promptly setting this friend on a multi-decade search for Miss Petrikin in order to fulfill Hardman's dying wish. When this all occurred, it was a widely public event reported in the newspapers and even cited in her obituary several years later as a time of great excitement and pride for the town. When Miss Petrikin died in 1899, she bequeathed her home and the lot on High Street to the Women's Christian Temperance Union, of which she was a longtime member, for the establishment of a meeting hall where the members of the group could gather to organize for the rights of women. On this site, the WCTU would eventually build Petrikin Memorial Hall, which still stands today, and of which Mary Blanchard closely oversaw construction as president of the Petrikin Committee. From the Bellefonte Republican on October 24th, 1901. Work is progressing rapidly on the beautiful building now being erected by the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Bellefonte on the ground at High Street, so generously donated to them by the late Marion Petrikin. This building is to be known as Petrikin Memorial Hall in memory of this Christian lady whose life and character has so endeared her to every citizen of her native town. Mrs. John P. Harris, president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union of Bellefonte, will go through the ceremony of placing a box in the cornerstone which shall contain a sketch of the building and Miss Petrikin. Much of how Miss Petrikin conducted herself was somewhat typical of a man. She never married because all of her close male relatives had passed on many years earlier, she retained much of her financial freedom until she became much older. She even signed her last will and testament as M.W. Petrikin, leaving out the Miss, much in the way that men did not always sign their name as Mr. As I mentioned, the only way for women to have control over their own finances at this time was for all of their close male relatives to be dead. So Marion's financial freedom came at the cost of losing half of her immediate family. In her old age and deteriorating health, the execution of her will was overseen by her male Harris cousins, who were also the brothers of Dr. Shadd, as well as the pallbearers who brought Miss Petrikin to her final resting place in Union Cemetery. But what does all of this mean for us today? In my research of Marion and these other women, I was reminded of some other female suffragists who greatly contributed to our rights today on a national scale, but who have also not received the recognition they deserved. This story will hopefully give some more context to the political atmosphere at the time when all of these women were challenging the social standards for women. In 1913, women's suffrage groups across the country held a national women's march for the right to vote, including right here in Bellefonte. Women in and around national and state capitals often picketed outside the gates to protest for their right to vote. This right to peaceful protest is one firmly enshrined in the First Amendment, or so they thought. In 1917 and 1918, Woodrow Wilson signed into law the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which effectively made protesting or any criticism of the government of any kind illegal. Wilson did this to prevent unrest among Americans on the subject of the Great War, to make it appear that the United States was a united front in the war. These laws were challenged in the 1919 Supreme Court case Schenck v. United States, where the Supreme Court ultimately ruled unanimously that the Espionage and Sedition Acts did not violate the First Amendment, and that the federal government should be granted more deference in times of war. As an aside, Charles Schenck, a man of German descent, was arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts for distributing anti-draft leaflets, and some believe that his conviction was motivated by anti-German sentiment, which flourished during the years before the war, and in part thanks to the temperance movement's association between Germans and alcohol and loose morals. Further, it is in this decision by the court that Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes established a clear and present danger test to determine whether or not speech is protected by the First Amendment. The court decided that Schenck's distribution of anti-draft leaflets during a time of war was akin to shouting fire in a crowded theater when there was, in fact, no fire. All of this is to say, the Espionage and Sedition Acts made any protest by any women's groups for their right to vote illegal, and many of them were arrested for it, making women's rights activists among the first political prisoners in the United States, right along with Schenck and other anti-war advocates. Though women's suffrage realistically had very little to do with the war at hand, protesting for this right still got many women arrested and sent to prison workhouses. Prisoners included prominent suffragists like Alice Paul, the founder of the National Women's Party. While in prison, the suffragists continued their protests by entering a hunger strike. As a response, prison guards began force-feeding those on hunger strike. Force feeding is still a terrible procedure today, 100 years later, so I can only imagine how painful and dangerous it must have been for the suffragists at prison at a time when penicillin had not even been discovered. Most died from the injuries or infection they sustained while being force-fed, with others confined to sanitariums upon their release. The suffragists on hunger strike were not the only ones to plead specifically for women's suffrage. When President Wilson was up for re-election in 1916, a year before the Espionage and Sedition Acts went into effect, Alice Paul and the Women's National Party organized a picket through Washington, D.C. to protest Wilson's re-election. Women stood outside the White House as sentinels of liberty, symbols of the lack of liberty which women were afforded at this time. Over 500 women were arrested for protesting, with over 150 being beaten in jail. It was as a result of the unlawful arrest of over 500 protesters that Wilson finally gave his support to women's suffrage, and the 19th Amendment was ratified 4 years later in 1920. I wanted to tell these stories to give us more context for how important the work local women were doing. They may not have participated in hunger strikes or massive protests outside the White House, but they did real-life work that continues to have an impact on us today. The other important lesson from these stories is that none of it would have been possible unless the women had all worked together. The massive protests would have meant nothing without real action coming from average women on the ground up. They worked together in small communities all over the country, just like Bellefonte, to ensure the success of the movement. To illustrate this point, I wanted to demonstrate just how many connections there were between the women I've talked about today. So, the Blanchard and MeGarvey sisters operated their businesses at the same time. Dr. Shad and Dr. Meek were the only female members of the Center County Medical Society together. And Dr. Shad provided end-of-life medical services for Marion Petrikin, as well as the MeGarvey sisters and Marion Petrikin attended church together. As we can see, all of these women were likely inspired by the others. It shows how a vital teamwork was to the success of women's rights. Women demonstrated locally and nationally that they could do just what men do, and that they should have the same rights too. They did charitable work, they owned businesses, they achieved great academic success, they saved lives. They proved that what should have already been common knowledge, and society 100 years later is all the better for it. Well, the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, in practice it only allowed white women the ability to vote. Women of color were still subject to the same challenges as men of color when it came to voting, like poll taxes and literacy tests, which whites were frequently not required to submit to. Women of color have really only been able to vote in the same fashion as white women since the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and many other challenges still face women and people of color in the voting process, like voter ID laws or restrictions on polling locations. As we continue to make advancements for women, we must remember how far we have come and how far we have to go. Finally, I wanted to thank you all for listening today, and I wanted to give special thanks to Robin DeGiratu and Center County Library for allowing me to come be an intern this summer to complete this project, as well as the Bellefonte Women's Club History on Wheels Committee for all of their support as well. And if you were interested to learn more, I have listed a bunch of my resources right here, and you'll be able to access these after the presentation if you're interested. All right, thank you all so much. Have a great day.